Well, it's not just television, is it? I went to boarding school as a teenager, and near my boarding school was this, in Shropshire in the Midlands, was this road that was sort of locally known as the Cursed Road or the Ghost Road. And at certain times of the year, at certain times of day, there were a disproportionate number of car accidents along this road. And it turned out, when this was kind of investigated and somebody applied some thought to it, that the trees were very regularly planted down one side of this road. And sort of in the autumn, when the sun was low in the sky at sort of 5 o'clock, knocking off time or whatever, at about 30 or 35 miles an hour, the flickering was enough to, in some people, induce a photoepileptic seizure. And so a disproportionate number of people crashed their cars on that road. And the way they solved it was they just chopped down every third tree. And suddenly the problem went away. Suddenly that repetitive flashing pattern of the sun, coming through the trees was gone. And so photosensitive epilepsy is it's a medical thing where visual disturbance at just the right frequency can upset the processes that go in your brain and can lead to a seizure. It's not like epilepsy where people who really suffer from that condition are out for a long time, but it can cause momentary disorientation and loss of consciousness. And I suppose it's been known about in television for quite a long time. The program that everybody points to as being the one that kind of brought this to light was an episode of Pokemon, the Japanese anime show, which I've just got up on screen at the moment, the YouTube clip. And if you've ever watched it, you can see exactly why it should be problematic. There's a sequence where you've got very rapid inter-frame flashing between red and blue, and you can see that if somebody was prone to a seizure from that kind of thing, that would be the thing to trigger it. And so I suppose in the late 90s, early noughties, I first became aware of it, that Ofcom were getting quite hot on this. And in fact, the first year of Big Brother, which was 2000, we had PSE detectors in our edit suites then, it's kind of becoming more important since. There's a very good Wikipedia article on it, which I've just popped up, and one of the world's sort of renowned experts in the field is this guy called Dr. Graham Harding, who is well respected and knows obviously done a lot of research in this area. But we'll talk about him a bit later, because he's significant in this arena. I've just stuck up the page from the Ofcom guidance, notes on flashing images and regular patterns in television. This is the revised in 2005. There's been a later revision, 2009, but this is the appendix for that, and I don't have the appendix for the 2009 update. So what it talks about is a potentially harmful flash. So it's sometimes referred to as a flash event, and it says a flash event is an increase in luminance followed by a decrease, or a decrease in luminance followed by an increase of at least 20 candelas per metre squared or more between successive frames of video. So I isolated 3 frames of video, which I'm just going to stick up now, and all the clips I'm going to use this evening I grabbed off telly last week from the royal birth. And the thing that often shows up these flash events most, exactly, paparazzi pictures. Yeah? So I'm just framing through 3 frames of video now, and it's a car parked outside the St Mary's, the hospital where the royal baby was born, and the first frame is normally illuminated by the early evening daylight, and the second frame is massively illuminated by the flash of a photographer's camera, and then the third frame returns to being very similar to the first frame. And it's that momentary huge change in a picture that is a flash event. Now, the Ofcom specs, if I go back to that, the Ofcom specs says that it's right at the very end. Let's go back to the beginning. It says that 1 flash event or 2 flash events or even 3 flash events are okay, but if you have more than 3 flash events within 9 frames, then that's a violation. And so that's a very simple description of what's allowed. If you imagine if you were Mr. Tektronix or somebody else who made video test equipment, it would be very easy to implement that in software. And in fact, in the early noughties, there were several manufacturers that made flash detecting machines. So the one that was my favourite was the Gordon, the Flash Gordon it was called, made by BPR, broadcast product research. And as I say, when I was working on Big Brother, we had one in several edit suites, and it was a great machine because it just takes video in and timecode in, and when it detects a flash violation, it honks, a beeper and freezes the timecode on the display. And the editor can go back and do something about it. He can scroll back over his timeline and say, oh, if I shorten the shot by 2 or 3 frames each end, then I can get my sequence in under the specification. So it was a splendid machine. But for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later, they're no longer really a big player in the market, and it's really more down to Harding now. He's the only game in town, really. So. Whereas before I had at the Ofcom spec, I've now popped up the DPP spec. Now, DPP is, as we'll refer you back to our file-based QC podcast. But the DPP spec is kind of becoming very important, and it's what will govern television delivery really from the second half of this year onwards. And in section 3 of that, it reiterates what Ofcom says. In fact, it's exactly the same wording, and so here it is up on screen now. 20 candelas per metre squared or more difference across the 3 frames. So the middle frame is more than 20 candelas per metre squared different. But you say to yourself, well, hang on a second, how on earth do you know how the punter's television has been calibrated? I know that the BBC will specify 80 candelas per metre squared for peak white, and again, we'll refer you back to our calibrating monitors episode. But how on earth do you know? How can you specify that? Because you don't know, how people's televisions are calibrated. That seems ridiculous, and that's true. And I've got a picture of yours truly up on the screen, calibrating a Sony monitor. But it's that kind of gadget you have to use to tell you, the peak white coming off a monitor's surface. There's no way you can tell that apart from having an instrument to measure it. But the Ofcom guidance notes are, come to our rescue, because what they say is, let me find the page. They say, so video waveform luminance is not a direct measurement of screen brightness, because obviously televisions and monitors are calibrated differently. Not all domestic display devices have the same gamma characteristic, but display with a gamma of 2.2, very standard for television, can be assumed for the purposes of this exercise. And it says, on average, we assume that a domestic television is calibrated for 200 candelas per metre squared peak white. So an awful lot brighter than a broadcast monitor, but that's the assumption we make, that 200 candelas per metre squared is what the peak white of a domestic television will be calibrated to, and that's probably quite fair. It's in that ballpark, and so that means that the as you know, when we all had CRTs at home, 100 candelas per metre squared would have been considered quite a bright telly, and it wasn't unusual for you to close your curtains to watch the telly in the daytime at least. But you don't really do that anymore with a plasma or an LCD. So modern tellies are driven a lot brighter. But I suppose on the other side, an LCD doesn't pulse in the same way that a CRT does. A CRT has built-in kind of flicker, and that's known to exacerbate photosensitive epilepsy. So horses for courses. Modern tellies are a lot brighter, and so they are perhaps more likely to provoke PSE, but then again they don't have the built-in kind of flickeriness that a CRT does. So yes, so once we've kind of reached this specification of we're allowed a 20 candela per metre squared difference between frames, and we're assuming a 200 candela per metre squared calibration for peak white point for a domestic television, then we have something that can be tested electronically. If we're going between a good frame, an offending frame, and a good frame, if there's more than 10% luminance difference between those frames. In fact, the picture I've got up, I've got a little histogram window next to it, and you can see that really is a bit more than 10% difference. It's quite gross. So that would be a flash event, and kind of 3 of those inside 9 frames, and that would be a no-no. And in fact, here's the little graph they give at the end of the Ofcom document with gamma applied and video voltage along the x-axis and light output in candelas per metre squared up the y-axis. But of course, we're back into this thing of who uses analog video anymore. But of course, by common consent, we regard even digital video to be representational of a voltage. But there you go. So as I said, back in the early noughties, there were several machines you could buy. There was Chromatech had a machine, BPR had the Flash Gordon, that was very good. But the machine that became very popular was the Harding FPA. Now, the thing about the Harding was that, as I say, Mr. Harding is considered to be something of an authority in the area. He's got lots of published papers, and in fact, if I just go back to the Ofcom document, half the references in there are to papers written by Mr. Harding, and so nobody doubts his ability in the area. But the problem is that his machine does a whole bunch of extra stuff that the Ofcom spec doesn't call for, and the Flash Gordon and other machines don't test for. He tests for sort of quite elaborate sort of red patterning and things like repetitive patterns and things that nobody else really knows what he's doing. And so consequently, when the BBC and Channel 4 and Red Bee Media and lots of other people sort of embraced the Harding as their box of choice, of course, if you're a facility delivering to one of those big broadcast companies, you now have to have a Harding as well. Seems a bit iniquitous, really. You can say, well, hang on, I invested all this money in my Gordon machine. Now, the Gordons weren't expensive by comparison. The standard def machines are only about £1,000, and the high def machine is only £3,000. Mr. Harding will charge you £13,000 for his machine. But if I want to deliver to Red Bee or to the BBC, I've got to have this more expensive machine because it's testing for a bunch of stuff that nobody else tests for. And truth to tell, the regulator doesn't call for, but it seems to be he's kind of inserted himself and he's in a position to now call the shots. It doesn't seem quite right somehow. It sounds that way, doesn't it? So I did a bit of a straw poll of friends at facilities, broadcast facilities, about a year ago. This was so. Ascent Media, who at the time were doing Channel 5's delivery, Coding and Mux, they have the Gordon as their sort of day-to-day machine. And ITV's QC department at Upper Ground use the Gordon as their first pass analyzer. Channel 4 have it internally as well, but they all specify Harding to external facilities companies, which seems doubly iniquitous. Now if you imagine that the Harding for a long time, you'd have to play the finished program into it, have it do an analysis pass of the file that had been created, and then you handed the resultant report back to the editor, and he'd have to kind of sort it out. It's only been very, very recently they've had a real-time machine that can analyse in real time. And so if you imagine you've got like a half-hour program, it takes half an hour to play it into the machine. Until quite recently, they all processed in slower than real time. So just to do a single flash analysis of a program would take 2 or 3 times the length of the program by virtue of that you've got to play it in, analyse it, and give the report back to the editor. Whereas with the Gordon, it could just sit there in the edit suite beeping when it detected a violation. So but I'm hopeful because the DPP spec, which everybody's getting behind, really is specifying Ofcom as the preferred testing regime and not Harding. No. So we just kind of hope that they'll pick up on it. And so the other. So as I say, there are still things you can buy that will do flash analysis that aren't a Harding box. VidChecker, my favourite software-based video QC tool, which we did our file-based QC episode on. That does flash analysis, and I've just popped up the menu item from VidChecker that shows what it's testing for, and it's got just a couple of little presets. There's apparently a standard and a strict test. The standard looks very much like the Ofcom, and the strict looks a bit more like Harding. And then it's got a couple of checkboxes: check for saturated red flashes or check for potentially harmful regular patterns. And this is kind of Harding light. This is them trying to ape what they suspect Harding does. So the top part of the dialogue is gets you to Ofcom, and the bottom part is kind of, we're trying to ape Harding. But I spoke to the product manager at Tektronix, who's responsible for the WVR and WFM series scopes, and he said they've had beta software for ages, but they're loath to put it out there because either people won't bother using it because it's not harding, and then that would be a waste of money, or they make it a bit more capable and a bit more like harding, and in which case harding comes down hard on them because he's got lots of patents in this area. So it's a bit of a tricky one, and we hope that DPP will kind of set it all to rights, as it were. So I've got a bit of video here which I grabbed off air the same evening as I did that bit of BBC News 24. This is a clip from Sky News, and just listen. I don't know if you can hear the audio return, Hugh, So just what the newscaster she says. The first thing she says is just a warning that this report has lots of flash photography in it.
Delighted. A warning: this report from Sky's royal correspondent Paul Harrison contains flash photography. In case you didn't know, it was spelled out.
So we'll just let that play through for a few minutes, no, a few seconds, because this first shot is of a town crier standing outside the hospital, and there's lots and lots of flash photography going on. Every few frames has got lots of flashing going on. So I'll just pause that and move it out of the way onto the other monitor there. And in fact, I've got up on screen now the report when I analysed this piece of video from VidChecker. And all I did with VidChecker, I made a template where I just turned on PSE analysis. And we can see it's exactly what we would expect. So for that clip, from 12 seconds into 14 seconds in, up to 9 flashes per second, at least 20 candelas per metre squared, covering 48 to 64% of the, and it's all flash events that have been logged here. And in fact, they're all the way through. So if I spin past the shot of the town crier, let's see if I can find another flashy part. Okay, so yeah, looks like a royal spokesman coming out of the hospital. So let's put that back there. And yeah, look, that's very obviously kind of a violation. So obviously live television, you're bedeviled by the fact that you've got quick turnaround packages that you have to play in, and you might not have had the opportunity to do any meaningful flash pattern analysis. So I've just got another clip as well, which I grabbed off, same evening again, off Al Jazeera. Now, as you'd expect, they didn't feature the royal baby quite as much, but I did manage to find one bit of the Al Jazeera coverage. So it's just the presenter doing her piece of camera in the studio, and they go onto the VT package. And interestingly, although they do have some shots with flash photography in, so the one up at the moment has some flash photography in which they've also got a shot outside the hospital with a tiny bit of flash photography, but not much. And then again, spokesman coming out of the hospital talking to somebody in a car, and there is some flash photography, but it's kind of off to one side of the frame. And then I don't think there's anything interesting in the rest of it, so let's pause that and take that off screen. And interestingly, when I ran the same PSC analysis using VidChecker on that, it didn't throw up a single flashing error. So it is entirely possible to do that kind of stuff without violating it, but it's your choice of material, really, isn't it? Yeah, I think it just you are allowed to cover yourself by giving that little warning at the head of the piece, isn't it? Flash photography from the outset, and that's that. Yes, although interestingly, the United States, you could argue that they're the most litigious country in the world, and yet they have no standards governing PSC. Yeah, it just hasn't caught on there at all. Very significant in Europe and Japan, but not so much in other parts of the world. So, I really don't know what to make of it. I've never personally felt nauseous from witnessing it myself, although clearly there is material to suggest that some people do suffer